Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel and we're back with another video. Today I want to talk to you guys about complex PTSD. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and I like to talk about basically what it is, what it is caused by, and what are the main symptoms. And I also like to include which symptoms I personally do experience or have experienced, and as well the help I'm currently getting and what effects that gave in my case. Um, Without further ado, let's dive into it. To start with, there is a distinction between normal PTSD and complex PTSD. Normal PTSD tend to happen, to develop after a person goes through a singular event of trauma, and that can be in any particular type of trauma, either it be a sexual trauma or a car accident or any form of trauma which happened in one particular point of time for a singular time. Well, complex PTSD, it is complex because it is caused by people who have repeatedly experienced traumatic events, and especially, for example, when it happens very early in your life on as a child, it causes even more complex symptoms, and especially when the trauma that occurred happened by a person who is one of your parents or should be a caregiver, that causes the complex PTSD. And it's complex because it happened over a long period of time, and the trauma reoccurred and reoccurred and reoccurred. Other than the singular trauma happened once. Let's take an example. You are 22 and you go into a gigantic car accident whereby you might maybe lose someone like a passenger, and you've seen it all. That's gigantically traumatic. Then the possibilities of developing PTSD are very likely. Whereby, if you have complex PTSD, something very traumatic happens, like, for example, by a parent's either physical abuse or sexual abuse, and it happens over time, and it happens again, 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 and there's no escape because you're a child. And especially, as if that wouldn't be terrible enough yet, if that happens by a stranger, if it happens by one of your own caregivers, the one you're supposed to trust in, that makes it the more complex. And by saying this, in no means I try to tell that if trauma happens a singular time, or if it doesn't happen by a caregiver, that it's therefore less horrible. In no way I want to compare any trauma as being more or less severe, because trauma is trauma. But for the sake of where people get diagnosed with complex PTSD, this is a definition, and I hope that gives a bit of clarity. And of course, I'm not a therapist. I am in therapy, in fact, and I just share what I have learned so far. So if you want more in-depth information or you feel like you want to know more, then reach out to a professional therapist and they can tell you all the further details. There is a range of symptoms that can include complex PTSD or regular PTSD. I don't even know if I mentioned that in the intro, but if it wasn't obvious yet, myself, I suffer from complex PTSD and I'm diagnosed with that and I'm in therapy for that, as I said. So let's move on to possible symptoms of complex PTSD. And I will also include if that is something I suffer from or not, and how that looks like for me. That doesn't mean that your experience can, or someone else's experience who does have PTSD will be exactly the same, because how and to what intensity symptoms occur in someone is really dependent on the person, the trauma, and so many factors. So please just see this as it is, and that is my experience with it. One of the symptoms may include intrusive thoughts, that during the day all of a sudden thoughts pop up about the distressing event and the trauma that you went through. For me, that didn't really happen in the form of thoughts about the event, but I got other distressing, intrusive thoughts. And now through therapy, I learned that they root in my trauma. So I didn't have specific thoughts about things that happened to me, but more general intrusive thoughts, and I might make a video about that another time, but that had to do with my OCD symptoms. Nightmares. Myself, I never had nightmares. I have a friend of mine who also suffers from complex PTSD, and that person really suffers from a lot of nightmares. But myself, I never had that. Whereby in a nightmare it's possible that you really relive the traumatic event. Avoiding reminders, for me that has really been the case. I find it hard at this point online to really dive into the specifics and the details of the traumas I went through. I might open up about that later, but for this point I find that through fragile online, so I will not go in deep details of explaining how the symptoms occur in me. Memory loss, that's for me a real one. This tend to happen because of the traumatic event. Your brain and your amygdala get so overstimulated that as a protective mechanism, your brain shuts off certain parts so that you can't remember them. And in my case, that results in I cannot remember the full story of trauma. So there are like some gaps in my mind if I try to remember it and talk about it. So I cannot recall all the details, and then it doesn't become a chronological story anymore. I always struggle with this word, hypervigilance. This means that all the time your fight and flight system is active and you're full of adrenaline, and with a sound or something that conscious or subconscious reminds you of the trauma, like, and not even if you have a possible trigger, it can occur. So you are constantly on guard. And I used to have that all the time when I was alone in my house, in my room, constantly on guard, constantly convinced something terrible is going to happen, or that someone was in my house, or that I was going to get attacked. And that's very distressing. Like, you feel so unsafe to the odds that your heart is racing constantly. Another one is flashbacks, so that you literally, like, the most common way people see flashbacks is that you see things before your eyes as if they happen again, like randomly, that happens during day or night. For me, I had this thing called like emotional flashbacks. So not that I literally saw things before me, but feeling wise, as if you go back 10, 20 years back in time, and it is as if you're in the situation again. And that happened to me very, very often. Thanks to therapy now, that is almost nearly gone after many, many years of having this, which is exhausting, and I'm so thankful for that. Another symptom might be difficulty feeling positive emotions. Like, you might easily say, okay, that just means being depressed, and maybe that's one way of defining it. But if you always have been in a situation whereby there was constant threat and constant survival, then emotions like happiness or feeling joyful, all those things of happiness and um, feeling lucky, feeling like life is on your side, those feelings are alienated from you because you never experienced them. So it's like, it's really hard if happiness comes along your way, or you feel unhappy emotion, to really give yourself to that, because it nearly feels like a threat because you're not used to it. So that's something I also really experienced, especially with having depression alongside as a result. Another thing is self-blame. You blame yourself for the things that happened as if they were your fault. It's something I also really struggled with, and it really took therapy for me to see that none of those things were my fault and I'm not to blame for them. But it can take quite a journey to see that you are deserving of happiness, that you're deserving of good things, and that not all the blame is on you. Avoiding people and places and things, that has been something really vivid for me, something that I really did, and I am still fighting to break that pattern. And for me, it really went together with self-isolation, which is another symptom, that you really tend to isolate yourself from people because you perceive all people and the whole world as unsafe. So it always feels safer to be alone, even if that alone means loneliness, even if that alone means being frightened, being alone, even if alone means suffering on another level. But your system thinks it's way safer than be close to people. And it's something I really deeply experience, and I'm currently trying, with the help of therapy, to break that by reaching out to people when I feel something like that. Which goes together with, sorry, I have to look at my notes. With, yeah, another thing is anger and irritability. It's because of the trauma, your ability to deal with small frustrations has lowered significantly. There's a concept called the window of tolerance, and people usually during the day they move through a window, like not through, but in between a window, a line. And for example, if you don't have PTSD and you have a stressful day at work, your line goes up in a graphic and goes down if you're home and you relax and you come to a normal level, which you can manage. with people with PTSD, that window of tolerance, that tolerance level has become really small, because in the trauma, constantly they are on hyper arousal, constantly they have adrenaline, constantly they had to be on guard, sometimes for years, which really declines the ability to deal with life's small frustration, because you're constantly in a survival mode. And myself, I sadly really had that. I tried to not to show that to the outer world, but alone mostly, or with people, the people closest to me, got to experience that I can get really easily anger outburst and very irritative. And when I had a hard day at work, I couldn't regulate that anymore. I didn't know how to deal with it, because my toleration of frustration was so low that I did not know how to regulate that. Then we come to the last two, and one is emotion regulation. It's more not a symptom, but more of a result of the trauma. And in my case, that resulted in outbursts of emotions and being very clingy and needy to the people close to me and the people I love, because I developed a gigantic inability to cope with heavy emotions, to cope with emotions in general, to cope with feelings. And normal people who don't have PTSD, they tend to regulate their emotions. So if something happens during the day, like they're angry or irritative or sad, they take measurements to cope with those feelings, and their system can regulate that normally. But if you have complex PTSD, your system don't know how to regulate that. When you were young, there was no caregiver to teach you that skill, to help you, to nurture you, to regulate your emotions, and thereby you have like a disability to cope with emotions and to regulate them, so that you can nurture yourself. And that is something you have to learn later as an adult in therapy, because it's so hard to teach that yourself, because it was the role of another parent, another caregiver. It was the role of an adult. And now you're an adult, you have to give yourself something that someone else was supposed to give you. And therefore, it's so wonderful if you have therapy to help you with those things. And currently, I can say I'm really learning to regulate my emotions. It keep on being a struggle sometimes, because it is a deep-rooted wound. But with the help of therapy, I'm learning to regulate more sooner and in a healthy way, instead of in trying to regulate in a destructive way to suit yourself. And last but not least is risky behaviors. And this actually does go also together with emotion regulation. If you really experience an inability to cope with your feelings and all the other symptoms, then the door is open to cope with all those difficulties in a destructive way, which can be alcohol, drugs, riskful sexual behavior, gambling, anything to numb your feeling. And I've wrote it down, and it can be defined as compulsive comfort seeking. What you're seeking is comfort of the constant pain, the constant terror that haunts you. And some of us seek very destructive ways to try to get that comfort, to get very high levels of endorphin, of very high adrenaline, in order to try to overflow this gigantic flow of negativity, of fear, of frustration, of inability. And please, if those are things you experience, talk to people, reach out to a therapist, because it only goes downwards. And I talk from experience, sadly. I've long coped with all my symptoms in a very destructive way, and I find it too fragile and personal to talk about that here. But trust me when I say I coped with it in very terrible ways. And thanks to therapy, now I have learned myself skills to regulate myself and to cope with the symptoms. So healing is really possible, but it's not an easy journey, and it takes daily efforts, and it takes to be on your guard daily for triggers and to cope with your feelings and to be aware of the stress in your life. There are so many things you have to try to manage, but healing is really possible, and I'm already in a better place than I was, and I reach further to keep on growing and healing to the extent that is possible for me, because there are some things we just have to learn to live with it, that they remain like a scar. And as a last thing, because I see I'm already talking way long, is the help of therapy. I already mentioned it vividly, but I got EMDR, and now I have to think really well the term EMDR, because I use it so much that I nearly forgot what it actually means. It was eye movement desensitization. I forgot the R. I might come back to that in the description. But what it comes down to is that you bring with a therapist your memories to the surface of the traumatic event, and then by offering distraction with the movement of eyes, then the memory got stored in a different part of your brain. And I don't have all the details here now how that works, but eventually the tension around the traumatic event goes lower, and it really helps to process the trauma. But I will come back to that more in another video, what that specifically means. But I just wanted to highlight here that this really helped me, although it took quite long for me to go through it and to really have results. Thank you all for listening, and for the people who don't know about this PTSD, I hope you gathered some information. And for the people who do experience this, I really want to say that healing is possible and that you're not alone. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all back with another video. Bye bye.